In this video, I'm going to show you some basic outline stitches. We're going to start with running stitch, back stitch, whipped back stitch, chain stitch and stem stitch. So I'm going to place some back stitch along the middle of this letter. So we're going to cast on with a knot on the surface and 2 small back stitches leading towards the beginning of the line. Bring the needle up at the beginning of the line and take your first stitch down about 3 to 4 millimeters along, not going into the casting on stitch but going over the top of the first one. Once the first stitch is in place, you can cut off the knot. With the second stitch, you now come up at the end of the second stitch where you want the stitch to finish, and you go back towards the first stitch, going into the same hole where the first stitch finished. It's important that they share a hole so that you have continuity from one stitch to the other. From now on, all stitches start at the far end of the stitch and go back towards the previous stitch, going into the same hole. Repeat that to the end of the line. And continue until your shape is covered. Once your stitch is finished, you can cast off in several different ways. The first way is to weave your stitches through the back of the embroidery by turning the hoop over and weaving the needle through the back of the stitches. The second way is to repeat what you did at the beginning with the casting on, making 2 little back stitches on another line that hasn't been stitched yet, and then cutting off the thread from the top. Alternatively, you can do these 2 tiny back stitches from underneath the stitch that you've just created and hide the casting off stitches underneath those back stitches. To cast off at the back, just take the needle through the back of the stitches and weave over and under at the back till the stitches are secure. Then you can cut the thread. So next I'm going to do a running stitch down the centre of this section here. Now with a running stitch, although it is an outline stitch, essentially you don't want to have a drawn line underneath the stitch because it will show. So you tend to use running stitch outside of a drawn line or inside a drawn line to fill in. So either as a highlight on the outside or as a fill in, or you can stitch freehand with a running stitch with no drawn line at all. Also with a running stitch, because you have gaps between the stitches, it's a little more tricky to cast on. So we would cast on nearby on a line, on a drawn line that you know is going to be covered over with your 2 back stitches as usual. And then start the running stitch nearby to where you've just cast on. These cast on stitches can then be covered later on when you get to that section. So I'm going to start with my running stitch, coming up at the beginning of where I want my running stitch to be, and we're just doing a straight line, a straight stitch, and then leaving a gap in between each of the stitches. Running stitch can be long stitches or short stitches. You can have long gaps or short gaps. You can alternate between long and short to create different textures and feeling of movement. So when you've filled in your area or gone around your area, you can then cast off again in a solid line that will be covered up later on with a different stitch. And then bring your thread to the front and cut. So next I'm going to create a stem stitch outline around the running stitch shape, covering over my 2 pieces of casting on with the stem stitch as I go round. So start a couple of centimetres away, as we've done before with the casting on, with the knot on the surface, and then the 2 small back stitches to get you to the beginning of the line. So coming up at the beginning of the line, going down the length of your first stitch, but as you pull the needle through, don't pull the thread all the way through, leave a loop on the surface. Now the loop should be on the right hand side of the direction that you're travelling with your stitch. So if you are coming back towards you, the loop will be on the opposite side because it's the right hand side of the direction that you're travelling. Then you come up halfway between where you've come up and where you've gone down with the needle. Bring the needle up, and as you bring the needle up, pull the loop tight. That is the first stitch, but also the beginning of the second stitch. With the second stitch, you've started at the halfway point of your first stitch, so come forward the same distance again, the same length stitch as the first stitch. Go down into the fabric, holding the loop on the right hand side and coming up at the halfway point. You may notice that the halfway point now is the same as the end of the first stitch. These 2 stitches will touch, and then pull your thread through to make them overlap. Just need to remove my knot. So again, repeating, the stitch should always be the same length and should always be on the line itself. Try not to angle the stitch in a diagonal line. You want your stitch to be straight on the surface, and the overlap comes from holding the loop. This will create a twisted thread like stitch. Bit like a rope twist. So as you start to add these in, the rope twist will become clearer. For the final piece, you can do a half stitch coming up at the halfway point and going down into the same hole as that previous stitch to create a half stitch into the corner. Or if you're doing stem stitch on a tapered line, you would do a full stitch, which would make it thinner at the edge. There are 2 different ways of finishing stem stitch. So next I'm going to be working with a chain stitch, and we're going to start with the outer edge. Now chain stitch can be used as an outline stitch for a thicker outline than the stem stitch. I'll start my chain stitch at the bottom here where it goes underneath the main shape. So using the 2 back stitches for casting on as before. And then coming up at the beginning of the line, ready to start the stitch. Now we're going to go back down the same hole, but don't pull the thread all the way down. Leave a loop on the surface and come up at the end of where you want your chain stitch to finish. And then as you pull the thread flat to the surface, trying not to catch on the loop. Pull the thread flat to the surface and pull tight. This will make the chain stitch elongated, so you'll have no gaps in between the loop itself. Then you can cut off the knot on that end. So now we've completed the first stitch, but this thread is now the beginning of the second stitch. So we want to go down into the same hole inside the loop of the first stitch. And again, holding on to that loop, don't let go of that. It will unravel. Hold the loop open and come up at the end of the second stitch, pulling tight and pulling it flat to the surface as you go. This means you can get a tight tension and get that elongated shape. Again, go inside the loop and into the same hole and repeat again, working our way around the outside edge. Here's an example of chain stitch used as hair. It can give you a nice texture for the hair strands. So if you'd like a variation on back stitch, and in fact any stitch, we can create a whipped back stitch. The process of this is to use a contrasting thread that comes up at the beginning of the first stitch and slides under the stitch from right to left. So you're not going through the fabric, you're just going underneath the stitch itself, and then coming back and sliding under the second stitch from right to left, and then under the next stitch. So you're taking each stitch and going round it from right to left. You can do this with most surface stitches to create an extra texture or a contrasting colour. And you can see that the back stitch has now become a bit like a stem stitch, but with two tones. So you've got the two colours overlapping like a rope. And when you finish, come through to the back and cast off. In the next video, we'll be looking at some filling stitches to fill in your design.